The state of play in 2020 is filled with frustration and hope, stops and starts, setbacks and progress. It's not unlike much of our society in this turbulent year. We're going to talk now about the national data Project Play collected from 2019 before the pandemic, thanks to the Sports and Fitness Industry Association, and also new data collected during the pandemic with Utah State University. All of this can be found in our new National State of Play 2020 report at as.pn/SOP2020. For the first time, the report is digital and includes data for youth ages 13 to 17, in addition to 6 to 12. First, it's worth knowing that real progress was being made in 2019 to grow sports participation. 61% of kids ages 6 to 12 play team sports on at least a casual basis, the highest on record dating to 2012. 620,000 more kids at least tried sports once in 2019. That's progress. 38% of kids play team sports on a regular basis. That marked the third straight year with a slight participation increase after years of decline since this number peaked at 45% in 2008 prior to the Great Recession. In 2019, sports like baseball, cheerleading, field hockey, flag and tackle football, gymnastics, ice hockey, soccer, softball, track and field, and volleyball all had higher participation rates. The long-term challenge of recovering from COVID-19 will be even more difficult than the Great Recession. There are both financial and health factors to return to play. In 2019, we continued to see the haves versus have-nots about who can access sports. Before the pandemic, 23% of kids ages 6 to 12 in families making under $25,000 played sports on a regular basis. That was slightly up from 22% a year earlier. Meanwhile, 49% of kids in homes earning over $100,000 played sports regularly. The gap between high and low income youth was 15 percentage points in 2012. By 2019, it was 22 points, and it's likely only going to accelerate due to the pandemic. Some good news, in 2019, the percentage of kids 6 to 12 who were physically inactive declined for the fifth straight year. Kids continue to move their bodies at slightly higher rates, but we know from more current research that physical activity has declined by about half during the pandemic. Another positive in 2019 was an increase in the percentage of coaches who are being trained. More coaches reported they were educated in CPR, basic first aid, concussion management, general safety and injury prevention, sports skills and tactics, and effective motivational techniques. This is credited in part to a concerted effort by many organizations in youth sports that are taking action to train coaches, but more quality training is still needed. Before the pandemic, youth sports parents on average said their child played sports about 14 hours per week. During COVID-19, that has dropped to about 7 hours per week. Even before the pandemic, there was an unhealthy balance between the number of games and practices. The American Development Model recommends a 3-to-1 practice-to-game ratio for most age groups. During the pandemic, free play, practices, and games have all significantly declined. Time spent on virtual training has increased, but families making under $50,000 are only seeing slight increases in virtual training compared to larger growth in this area by wealthier families. You can visit as.pn/SOP2020 to find all of the sport-by-sport data on the number of hours spent before and during COVID-19. From June to September, parents reported more comfort with their child resuming sports when restrictions are lifted. Individual pickup games remain the form of sport by which parents have the highest comfort level. Parents are gradually becoming more comfortable with travel sports at 52%. That's up from 44% in June. But travel still trails community-based sports at 58% and interscholastic sports at 57%. There are still many parents not comfortable with kids playing sports. And that was reflected in our last slide. Parents' fear of illness, either for their child or themselves, has increased in each of the 3 surveys taken in May, June, and September. Today, 64% of parents fear their child will get sick by resuming sports. That's up from 50% in May. Black, Hispanic, and Asian parents express this fear at statistically higher rates than white parents. is another reminder that the recovery process is not going to be easy for youth sports. And with that, I want to bring in Travis Dorsch to discuss some of these topics. Travis is the founding director of Utah State University's Families and Sport Lab, and he took the lead on producing these recent surveys during the pandemic. Travis, thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate it, John. Thanks for having me.
So I want to keep this slide up on the screen for a reason and start by discussing another potential barrier for kids to resume sports. So you can see here, currently 29% of youth sports parents say their child is not interested in sports. That's up significantly from 18% in May and 19% in June. What do you make of this, Travis?
I think right now there's a lot of inertia out there. Many of us have been inside and only venturing out for our necessities since March. And this has been a long 6 months for many families, especially considering those families who are in more urban areas where some of the restrictions have been tighter. And with that, I think has sort of come a normalcy of not participating in sports. And it's going to take a nudge, I think, to get us back to that normal, to what sport used to look like. And we can talk about that in a little bit, whether that's a good or a bad thing. But I think this sense of just sort of staying at home, that's the new normal. And it's hard to get back out there and to trust the health consequences that come along with that.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, I don't think it's good having 3 out of 10 parents reporting this, particularly the significant jump from what we saw in May or June. Do you think these kids automatically bounce back into sports, or are there lessons that we need to learn about how to try to bring them back?
There's absolutely lessons. I don't think the bounce back will necessarily be automatic or fast. And we, as a system, right, the youth sports system, and that includes parents and families and practitioners and coaches, administrators, us as researchers, we need to decide what sports is going to look like when we come back from this pandemic. And I hope we come back strong, but this is a great chance for a reset. And I think, Tom Ferry did a great job talking about that in his article that was published 2 or 3 months ago now, but kind of rethinking or reimagining what youth sport can and should look like. And this is a wonderful opportunity that hopefully we're not going to get anytime soon. So for all of us to come together, to put a lot of smart people in the room, so to speak, and figure out what the design and the delivery of youth sport will look like moving forward, I think is our only chance to get these kids back. Because a lot of these families don't want to come back to the youth sports system that we have before.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that we're trying to promote is that, a community-based, more sustainable youth sports model. And I think that's what some parents are saying a little bit in this survey. I don't know if you come across that perspective as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think when you look at the data and you see the context that parents and families are more comfortable putting their kids back in, it's definitely that closer to home, more community-based, right, with friends that we know, not this travel conglomerate that we used to see so much of, where we're traveling 100 or 500 or 1,000 miles to go participate against the best of the best in far-off lands. We're seeing more comfort with parents allowing their children to return to, free play with friends in the neighborhood, to interscholastic sports where they're playing against kids at school, and to community-based sports where we know the coaches, we know the kids, and we're used to that 5-mile drive down to the local soccer field or local baseball field.
Last question. We know this is going to be a long process here, just for some people just getting back to return to play and then just the recovery. What data points are you really interested in looking in, both short-term and long-term, related to youth sports participation? What do we need to be keeping our eye on?
Yeah, a couple of interesting trends that we've seen in the data, John. First and foremost, children are moving away from sort of the indoor, the team sports, things like basketball, wrestling, swimming, gymnastics, and more towards opportunities to participate in individual sports and outside, which we know is safer at this point. That's what the science is telling us. Things like cycling, cross country, golf, tennis, we're seeing increases in those sports just from May and June now until September over the past 3 months or so. So it'll be interesting to follow some of those trends to see if they are in fact long-term or if they're just kind of placeholders, if you will, as children wait this out, children and families wait this out. A second thing I'm really interested in is the intersectionality of age, race, gender, and family income to see who's being affected more disproportionately by the pandemic when it comes to youth sports, participation, access, outcomes, and those sorts of things. So to look at some of those aspects of sport participation and understand better who's been affected more and or less by the pandemic, I think will be really interesting as we make our way through and hopefully soon out of the pandemic.
Right. Well, Well, thank you for joining us, Travis. And again, thanks again for your support. It's really valuable data that you've been collecting, here in the coming months. And again, for everyone, you can find the entire National State of Play report by visiting as.pn/SOP2020.
John, thanks so much. I appreciate everything you guys at Project Play are doing.
Thanks, Travis.